We record. And all of our lunch and learns, as long as the speakers are good with it, are posted on our YouTube site. So you are welcome to go to that site. Just type in Intermountain Center for Disaster Preparedness. You have to type it all in, not just put ICDP, and you can find our YouTube channel. All right. Hopefully you can join us for the rest of this series of our Lunch and Learns. Again, thank you for your support of the ICDP. And if we can be of service to you and your organization, please feel free to reach out. We're here to help. All right, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Aaron Titus. He is the Executive Director for Crisis Cleanup. They are a disaster relief collaboration platform that has documented $1.2 billion worth of volunteer service by 2,200 organizations after 179 disasters in 48 states and in 7 countries. He is the author of How to Prepare for Everything, which is an empowering method to prepare individuals and families for, well, everything. Aaron is the president of Mountain West VOAD, which is a 12-state coalition of relief organizations. He received his JD from George Washington School of Law and his undergraduate degree in architecture from our very own University of Utah. Aaron and his wife, Jennifer, are the proud parents of 10 children. So as he says, he has plenty of disaster response experience even at home. So I'm going to turn it over to Aaron. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And number 11 will arrive in July, as a matter of fact. So we haven't learned our lesson yet, I don't think. No, it's great to have so many helpers at home. Before I got into my formal presentation today, one of the other hats that I wear is I'm the co-chair of Boulder County VOAD in Colorado. As many of you are aware, Boulder County recently suffered a fairly significant fire. It was a grass fire that ended up destroying 1,100 homes, just kind of out of nowhere. And if you told me that I was going to be working a completely suburban fire around New Year's in a snowstorm, I would have told you you're crazy, but apparently that's the times that we live in right now. I do maybe with a little bit of gallows humor, tell people I'm in the only business that both biblical prophets and scientists agree is a growth industry, unfortunately. So I thought I would just give you a little bit of insight as to what we're seeing here, what makes this disaster unique. Every disaster is unique in some way or another, and some of the challenges and what's gone well and challenges that we've faced. So I'll do that to begin with for the first couple of minutes, and then I'll pause, and I really would like to know if there are any questions at all about the Boulder County fire response, and then we'll move into the formal presentation part. So around, I think it was on December 30th, that was either 3 days ago, 3 weeks ago, or 3 years ago, I can't really tell at this point. And there was a big windstorm and it sparked a grass fire. I was actually listening to it on the scanner, and it was very clear to me that 2 things were going to be true. Number 1, the evacuation was going well, and number 2, it was not under control whatsoever. And I started mapping dots on the map to see where these addresses are of that were on fire, being called out as on fire. And for the first little while, I was thinking, okay, this is a grass fire, we'll probably lose 1 or 2 homes. If it's really bad, we'll lose 10. And it became clear over the following hours that that this was huge, absolutely huge. And it was 2 or 3 days in a snowstorm before we finally wrapped our arms around the extent of the damage. As I mentioned, there were 1,100 homes. Even after the snow came in, we lost another 2 or 3 homes as the snow was falling, just because things were so intense. We had 100-mile-an-hour, 110-mile-an-hour gusts. The way that we do fires here in Colorado is pretty straightforward. They start in the mountains, and then when they burn to the base of the mountains, they stop because there's no more fuel. And that's the way we roll here, right? That's the playbook. This one did not follow the playbook at all. It's in the middle of the winter. This is 100% suburban. Like the houses themselves are the fuel, and trying to spread a fire just from houses is kind of unthinkable. I mean, we saw it in Santa Rosa a few years ago, but again, you have to have pretty extreme conditions. We opened up crisis cleanup for volunteer survivors to ask for help, for example, sifting through the ash. There's extensive smoke damage. So early on, there were 35,000 people under mandatory evacuation, of whom only 250 sought public shelter. And that does reflect the fact that this is a fairly affluent area. Of course, the larger area that was affected by smoke covers a much wider swath of the community. There was, the normal confusion, miscommunications, for sure. Problems. So I spent many days at the Disaster Assistance Center, or the MARC, Multi-Agency Resource Center, speaking with survivors and entering them in and just listening and crying with many of them. And I just want to share a few stories that have stuck with me, that I think kind of encapsulate the experience of many folks. There was one guy, and he said, I'm single, and I've been really burdened with all of my stuff. And now I'm not burdened anymore. It's kind of nice to have it all gone. I mean, this stinks, but I'm not burdened with that anymore. And I thought, good for you. It's going to be a rocky road still, but that's great. Another woman, sitting with her, and I was explaining how the process of ash sifting works. And suddenly she just broke into tears. And she asked me, so you mean there's hope that I'll be able to pass along something from my grandmother to my children? And, boy, it hits you hard, right? I mean, that's what this represents for a lot of people. You are able to recover quite a bit from the ash, anything that's ceramic, metal, even photographs on occasion will be pulled from the wreckage and return those to the owners. So there's been two groups in particular, the Southern Baptists of Colorado and Samaritan's Purse, who have been doing the ash sifting, most of it anyway. And they've covered around 200 homes at this point, give or take. Another woman I met, she was in her 70s, and they lived in a very tight-knit community. And her neighbors were both elderly, and she was at home and was not aware of the fire. It happened very, very quickly. And she got a call from her neighbor who was at the store, and looked over to see the plumes of smoke, and called her and said, "What's going on?" She said, I don't know. Went over and looked and said, "Oh, well, wow, there's a fire, and it looks like it's getting closer and closer quite rapidly." So her neighbor asked, "Would you please go get my dog out of my house before you leave?" And she said, "Yes, I will." So she ran across the street to get her neighbor's key at another neighbor's house, and she was headed back across the street to go retrieve her neighbor's dog when the sheriff arrived and told her to get out now. They lost the dog, and that's of course something that she has to carry with her and and begin to work through. She says she's up on text messaging at 3 a.m. with all of her neighbors because none of them can sleep. One of her neighbors, also in their 70s, tried to evacuate, and the man and his wife went out, and the man tried to open up the gate but could not open the gate because the winds were too high, and was closing the gate again, so he could not get his truck out to evacuate. His wife has Alzheimer's and continued to fall and was having a hard time standing up in the wind. The fire was so intense and the embers blowing so much that her sweater actually caught fire, just to give you an idea of the conditions at the time. They were able to get out and get a ride and were evacuated safely. But of course, their home was lost in the process. Um, boy, I think of another family. Mother came in with 4 teenagers. And while she was sitting down getting registered, I had a chat with the teenagers, and they were rather quiet. And so I just started making small talk. Now, one of the rules of disaster relief, and certainly emotional and spiritual care, is that you meet them where you just listen. You don't force them to relive their trauma if they don't want to. And I certainly wasn't going to do that. So I asked what I thought was an innocuous, just an innocuous question. What are your plans for today? And one of the kids said, well, we hired somebody with a dog so that we can go find our cat's remains in the ashes. And, that's just not something any kid should have to say. Another family, their home survived, but theirs was the only home in the entire neighborhood that made it. All of their other neighbors' homes were burned. And they expressed to me how grateful, on one hand, that they had, he worked from home, he makes violins. And so that was all able to be saved. They had immense smoke damage, of course, and that will be very costly to repair. But they were very grateful to have their home. They said, but in many ways, I'm happy that I have my home, but it would have been so much simpler if it had gone up. They're dealing with survivor's guilt, and all of the complexities that arise when you get to live in your home, kind of in a moonscape for the next several years. On the recovery side, as I mentioned, the largest immediate need on the cleanup is ash sifting. We have had a challenge early on. We had challenges with mixed messaging coming out of the county. The county public health department issued some statements that about ash that were probably scientifically accurate, not very useful, and instilled a great deal of fear in everyone. And which at certain points, shut down the voluntary response and the community engagement. And anyway, there was internal pushback, and eventually everything was clarified and things could move on. But there was definitely a lot of challenges around getting the messaging right when you have independent departments making decisions without coordinating with other community organizations or other departments even, and having downstream effects that that weren't anticipated at the beginning. Issues that we're running into: underinsurance. So this is the costliest disaster in Colorado history in terms of property loss. I think there's about $1 billion of homes of insured losses, primarily because these were multi-million-dollar homes. On the other hand, we have a lot of people who purchased their homes at $400,000 and it's now worth 1.1, but they only have insurance for 400. That's a pretty common issue. Rebuilding is a challenge in Boulder County. Boulder County is kind of a liberal vanguard of the state, and so complying with all of the new code regulations is quite costly and challenging. We had a fire a year ago. 22 homes went up in smoke, and so far only 3 building permits have been issued. So we anticipate that will be a big challenge going forward, not to mention just getting enough skilled contractors to come in and rebuild 1,100 homes. Trying to think what else. We're now working on setting up the long-term recovery group. With most long-term recovery groups, the challenge is getting engagement. This happened to be a high attention disaster. The president visited, for example, so we have a huge amount of community engagement, which is a blessing. It's also a double-edged sword because with a ton of community engagement and a ton of community organizations, also come the occasional ego, a little bit of turf, and a little bit of turf wars. We in the VOAD space, we have the 4 C's, and which I'll mention again later, but yeah, collaboration, communication, coordination, and cooperation. If they came naturally, we wouldn't need to promote them all the time. But so anyway, there's a 5th silent C, competition, and you know, that's a reality, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that fact. So I'm going to go ahead and pause right now. Any thoughts, questions at all about the Boulder County fires? I've already managed to put you all to sleep. My goodness. It's my superpower. All right. Well, my goodness. Oh, okay. Hey, there we go in the chat. Thanks, Lenore. How many agencies responded? A lot is the short answer. I don't know that we have a full count, but if you count all of the community organizations as well, well into the hundreds, you know, local faith communities and everybody. The issue, the challenge with a fire is, unlike a flood, you can just gonna send 1,000 unskilled volunteers into basements and muck out. You can't do ash sifting that way. It requires equipment, and it requires some skill. You have to know how to avoid debris and you know, not accidentally trip and fall on the sword collection that's hidden underneath the ash. So there have been far more volunteers and far more community engagement than there has been opportunities to serve. So I'll pause for just a few more seconds, see if any more questions come in on the chat, or please unmute yourself.
Erin, this is
Yes.
Robin.
Hey, Robin.
So when people wanted to help, what did you do? Like, were they upset that they couldn't help? Did you like say, hold on, we'll see?
Yeah.
What did you do?
Boy. So I'll answer that question with my Latter-day Saint Charities hat on, with my crisis cleanup hat on, and then with my Boulder County VOAD hat on, right? Because each, you know, with each constituency, you have to kind of answer to each one, the community at large. In general, I think people have been very understanding. In fact, unusually understanding. The coordination has actually been textbook. Within 48 hours, the DAC was set up, the Disaster Assistance Center. We kept looking. I mean, so it's number one, you keep looking, and number two, you communicate. The worst thing you can do is just tell people no with no explanation. It's like those, if you've ever been to Disneyland, at the front of the line, there's a sign that says, you know, wait from this point 45 minutes. Well, it doesn't make the wait time go any faster, but Disneyland has learned that informed customers are a whole lot happier than uninformed customers. And so simply communicating the fact that you're looking and we've tried A, B, C, D, and E, and here's why we cannot use the help yet, hang tight. That is really the key. Otherwise, people will self-deploy. They'll do something, which is usually donations and give stuff. We have an old Nordstrom that we've converted into a donation center. The state is sponsoring that, and it's actually going very well, but there is a lot of stuff there for sure. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. Communicate.
Yeah, so what was the best way that you did communicate to because obviously it's not just Boulder County that wants to help.
Yeah. Yeah. So communicating, of course, cash, right? Cash is best. That's a message that we often hear and share, but not only just giving the message, but explaining why. So, I would give an example. Like I can go to the store and buy a can for $1.25 and give it to the food bank, or I can give the $1.25 to the food bank and they can buy 5 cans of food and cover their overhead because of the relationships that they have. And people go, oh yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. Giving cash is psychologically not satisfying at all. And especially in a fire, everyone imagines, I have this thing and it's so important to me and precious to me. And I want to give that to someone who just lost theirs. And emotionally, psychologically, it's much more rewarding to give stuff as an individual. But frankly, a lot of donations management is meeting, accommodating the emotional needs of the giver rather than the actual needs of the receivers.
True.
A substantial portion of donations after disasters end up either being redonated to Goodwill or in the landfill.
Yeah, I can understand that. So what avenues did you use? Did you use social media, television, radio? How did you get the word out? Like,
Yeah,
I can understand the message. I just know
all of the
like
above.
there's just so many people that don't get something, or so I just wonder. Yeah,
So all of the above. I personally spent most of my time just communicating within my networks. I personally tend to turn off the news as soon as the disaster happens because I got a job to do and I got to focus on ground reality and not the 24-hour loop cycle. So I usually turn that off. I disengage on social media pretty quickly, but that's just me. I know that those messages were going out, all of those areas, as well as your networks, personal networks. There are a couple of questions in the chat here. Julie asked, could you speak more on the county messaging about ashes and how you and VOAD responded to this? Okay, well, at the risk of getting a little bit political, the first messaging that came out was don't touch the ashes. They contain low levels of carcinogens, which is correct. That's a true statement. You're putting yourself at risk. So under no circumstances should you ever touch the ash. There was a second message that came out further that said, if you engage in any cleanup on your property, you will be ineligible to receive FEMA assistance. Those messages kind of made my blood boil. Now there's kind of two ways to look at this, and I'll try to be objective about it. One way is to say, okay, I'm going to take everything that you said on face value. Even if it's all true, you're still being dumb. And another way is to say, I'm not taking it on face value. I don't actually believe what you're saying. So that second way, sure, you can ask me my opinion, but it frankly doesn't matter, right? I'm not a public health official. I'm not a specialist in the area. So my opinion's no better than anybody else's. So, but on the first one, I think the core of it is that those initial messages created a substantial amount of fear in the community. We had relief organizations that were fully engaged. And as soon as the public health department came out with their statements, I had 5 of them drop in 24 hours because they were just afraid. I had one of them call me up and ask me, am I going to get arrested if I distribute ash sifting boxes? I mean, that was the degree of fear that there was. We worked internal relationships and objected to it. It was blatantly incorrect that doing any degree of cleanup was going to invalidate, make you ineligible for FEMA assistance. That was just not correct. So they did issue retractions and clarifications. that, the trained volunteer groups were allowed to do the ash sifting, and technically there was no order, so it wasn't stopping you, but it still created a bunch of fear. I remember one family coming in and asking me, like, our house smelled a little bit like smoke. So we threw everything out, and I was just wondering, is it okay if I keep the sealed box of all the drawings from my kids from when they were little? Like, oh, for heaven's sakes, yes. If you're concerned about the you have a low level of ash, you have an even lower level of any contaminants. If you put on an N95 and go spray it off with compressed air, and if you need to, so it was those types of things. And then again, public health last week just decided to announce that they were going to hydromulch everything, which means spraying it with a kind of a mulch that will encapsulate all of the ash. And they started giving the relief organizations ultimatums. They said, you need to finish these 100 homes by Tuesday, which is 4 days, which is like beyond absurd. So, again, relying upon relationships, we brought these objections up to the other departments in the county, and we're now working together, which is very good. Like, the outcome was good. And so the relief organizations are now doing the ash sifting and reporting that to the county, who's then arranging to hydromulch after the sifting. And they're prioritizing, based upon location and the need to hydromulch. So that's those are the types of things. That was probably a long answer to a short question. Alyssa asks, is fire one of those natural disasters that takes longer to clean up and recover from? How do you rank that? That is really hard. I can't say definitively that it's one way or another, that it's going to have to do with a range of factors. And I would say the socioeconomic status of the community affected is going to be probably a primary determination. I'm thinking about Hurricane Ida, for example, and a hurricane in the bayous. Who knows how many years it's going to take. So I can't say definitively that it would or wouldn't be. Tim Moore, during Joplin, Missouri tornado, all references were destroyed. Outside agencies and adjoining jurisdictions were hindered during response and recovery due to the lack of visual aids. Was a similar situation encountered at Boulder? And if so, how did you overcome this nuisance? This nuance. Also, numerous people self-transported to the area hospitals, bringing all their possessions and even pets. How do you plan for this contingency? Good question. So there are high attention disasters and low attention disasters on a spectrum. Then there are catastrophic disasters and non-catastrophic disasters, again, on a spectrum. This was a high attention disaster, without a doubt. When you have the FEMA person, the FEMA director making weekly visits, and you have the president coming and everybody else coming on a regular basis and disrupting everything every time they come, it is a high attention disaster. However, it's not catastrophic in the same sense that a hurricane is catastrophic. One of the strangest parts of this response for me is, it's at my home. It's 15 minutes from my home, and it's in my county. So it's in my backyard, in my community. But as I'm driving to the affected areas, and I'm driving past the mall, and the mall's open and everything's fine. And in 5 minutes in every direction, you have a vibrant, active, fully functioning community. And I'm used to arriving on the scene, and where like everything's gone for 100 miles, and you've got to make sure you gas up way before you get into the affected area. So that was very strange for me. Yes, visual aids were destroyed, and it has been difficult to identify the homes. So fortunately, because it's a suburban area, Google does know pretty accurately which homes are which. However, when you go into the area now, you'll see people have spray painted the street number on the remains of, say, the garage door or something else. So, and as far as people evacuating with everything to area hospitals, we actually didn't have much of that at all. We had an excellent response for shelter. Pardon me. For sheltering, we had several local agencies get together and provide the sheltering, so that was no problem. And again, out of 35,000 under mandatory evacuation at the height, only 250 sought public shelter. So that everybody else found places to stay with family and friends, and many rented hotels. So again, this was a fairly affluent area, and so people were able to take care of themselves. So we are well into the presentation time. I love talking about this stuff. Let me go ahead. Let's see. Barb, let me just make sure that I get a time check. We're done by, is it 1 p.m. or?
1 o'clock, yes.
1 o'clock. All right. We would still definitely be done by 1 o'clock. So let me go ahead and move into that portion. Let me just grab something over here real quick. And I will share my screen. And by the way, I really, really appreciate the discussion. I would much rather be talking about what you want to talk about too. So I really appreciate the questions. All right, here. So on a recent trip across Wyoming, I took some time to look into the clear night sky blazing with stars. Far away from city lights, I could see faint dots, which were actually entire galaxies. I could easily see the North Star and the 3 stars that comprise Orion's belt. Orion's belt appears in more than 30 constellations across many cultures. If I lived in Hawaii and I looked at those stars, I would see the cat's cradle, not Orion. If I was part of the Ojibwe culture, I would see Wintermaker. And if I was Navajo, I would see First Slim One. The order we impose on the stars, the constellations we see, tells a story about us more than the stars. People are like stars. In this metaphor, you and I are stars. Our communities are constellations. Some stars are brighter than others. Others give us direction, like the North Star. But even the North Star does not connect with every constellation. And I've seen some people try very hard to bend communities to their personal will. So perhaps we can call those people black holes or something like that. Government and the people within communities tell 2 very different stories, or see different constellations after disasters. The community constellations tell a story of collaboration and compassion. Government's star systems tell a story of command and control. I hate disasters, but I love to see communities self-organize and watch humanity shine, like the stars coming out after the clouds have cleared. Look carefully and you'll see that our communities have already organized themselves. They have their own constellations. You don't need to impose order. Yet we have trained emergency management and law enforcement to look into the community after disasters and see chaos. We've trained these professions that the solution is to impose order. But imposing the wrong kind of order creates its own kind of chaos. To illustrate, here is a pine branch. It's complex. And if somebody were to ask me how many branches and needles it had, I couldn't tell you. To figure that out, I would need to remove the needles and place each in a neat stack. Doing so would impose order on this chaos so that I could control it. Of course, in the process, I would destroy the branch. Communities are similar. Imposing the wrong kind of order can cause harm. And yet our entire disaster response paradigm is built upon the concept of command and control and paradigm for imposing order. This bias manifests itself throughout ICS and government response structures. Consider several states' ESF 15 or 17, volunteers and donations management. First, it's called volunteer management, and not, note the control bias, not volunteer empowerment or engagement. Second, anyone who has worked with volunteers and donations knows that they are as similar as apples and rocks. In fact, the only thing they have in common is that they are messy things that emergency management wishes would go away. In her excellent book, A Paradise Built in Hell, Rebecca Solnit has observed that often government officials are trained to believe that if they are not in control, the situation is therefore out of control. Or if they don't impose order, the sky will fall. While bad things will happen and people will die, the sky does not fall, even after the worst disasters. Emergency management can control many types of disasters or emergencies, a hazmat spill, a car fire, and so on. But unlike these emergencies, disasters are by their nature overwhelming. If it is overwhelming, we call it an inconvenience or perhaps an emergency, but not a disaster. At a certain point, the disaster and the people it affects becomes fundamentally uncontrollable. We train emergency management to control an emergency, then we ask them to control a disaster. It's like we give them the tools to dam a stream and then tell them to stop the tide. Just as absurd as controlling the tide, it is also absurd to think we can control the people within the community and their natural human desire to help a neighbor. Turning them away always has devastating consequences for the community. During Hurricane Sandy, 1,000 homes flooded in a New Jersey town. After the storm, the city went on complete lockdown, allowing only residents to enter through checkpoints. Relief organizations, including my church, offered thousands of volunteers to help clean up, but the city refused. Weeks later, the city finally opened up and asked for volunteers. I was elated. I called and offered to help hundreds of their residents. The city officials seemed confused. That wasn't their job. Instead, they would only accept 10 volunteers to operate the chipper to clean up the park. In the end, we were never able to help the residents of that city. And this decision by city officials cost residents roughly $10 million. The emergency management profession has adopted and cultivated myths about volunteers and the communities they serve. Most notably, that individuals become panicked and volunteers are liabilities. Despite a century of evidence, we perpetuate the myth that we become panically mindless and dangerous after disasters. Action scenes in movies have panic scenes of masses that poses a bigger danger than the disaster itself. Gustave Le Bon, the author of the study of the popular mind, he said, when people are gathered together in a crowd, the mere fact of their being assembled results in each individual yielding to barbarous instincts, which, had he been alone, he would perforce have kept under restraint. In a crowd, Le Bon proposes, the resulting irresponsibility spreads from person to person like a contagion. That description from 1895 sounds a lot like today's Hollywood zombie apocalypse. Even though Hollywood is not known for sticking to the facts, other official voices join in the doomsday chorus. Even the CDC and FEMA uses the image of the zombie apocalypse to sell preparation. It's hard to beat the myth that we become selfish, homicidal freaks in distress. We've all seen the movie. Everyone in your community, except for you and maybe your love interest, has been assimilated into a mindless mob intent on your destruction. You're outnumbered and you have to deal with them alone. Fear of neighbor after disasters is so pervasive that it is embodied in law and law enforcement. In California, second-degree burglary is a misdemeanor. After disasters, the same nonviolent crime is punished as a felony. Other states have similar provisions. For example, in Mississippi, the penalty for damaging property or theft after a disaster skyrockets to 15 years of prison. Regardless of whether you believe that a theft should carry a 6-month or a 15-year sentence, theft is theft, and the punishment should be the same regardless of when the thief strikes. The difference between the punishments can only be attributed to fear that humans are extra dangerous after disasters. State laws embody the too common belief that humans are nothing more than brutish animals wrapped in a delicate veneer of civilization. The story goes that civilization will shatter when strained, leaving us naked and vulnerable in a Hobbesian state of nastiness. Without the protection of civility, we're liable to lash out at others like wild animals. This view of human nature ignores one vital fact. Even if you believe that humans are nothing more than mere barely tamed animals, then you must also acknowledge that we're social animals. Social animals band together in a harsh world. Ants and apes do not cannibalize one another every time dinner is served. Chimps and monkeys band together in times of stress. Fish swim in schools. Prairie dogs warn one another of danger. Social animals help one another when things get tough. Likewise, humans respond to major disruptions with love and collaboration. Ironically, people who poison themselves with fear of their neighbor are the most likely to be dangerous, especially if they are in a position of power. Fear makes you self-centered and causes you to see everyone as a threat. Self-centered survival encourages risky behavior like vigilantism. This is not a theoretical issue. After Hurricane Katrina, fear-driven people, including law enforcement officers, were far more likely to hurt or kill neighbors and call it self-defense. Even today, fear-filled humans who genuinely believe they are doing the right thing act out in violence against innocent people. A volunteer searching for survivors in the rubble is mistaken for a looter and shot on sight, even though theft is not an executable crime. A hungry survivor taking food from a store that is about to burn is summarily killed. From San Francisco in 1906 to World War II, to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, to the Flint, Michigan water crisis, to the ongoing Hurricane Ida response, the story of every major disaster includes subplots of misguided belief about human nature. In Antony and Cleopatra, William Shakespeare wrote, "In time, we hate that which we often fear." Fear and cruelty go hand in glove. Where we allow fear to turn into hate and cruelty, violence tears the community fabric after disasters and disruptions. Therein lies the irony. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt will, if you let them, transform you into the homicidal, self-centered creature that it purports to fight. Zombies aren't real unless you allow fear to turn you into one. Disasters and disruptions do not usually cause panic. Social scientists have documented thousands of disasters across the world, and the outcomes are always the same. Human behavior is overwhelmingly collaborative and loving. Neighbors help neighbors. People are very polite. Panic and antisocial behavior is rare and overblown by news outlets. My experience and the experience of my disaster relief colleagues is consistent with the social science research. This phenomenon is summed up by a play on a common axiom: disasters knock down fences and make good neighbors. This sense of solidarity dominated the national psyche after the attacks on September 11, 2001. After Hurricane Sandy, Cory Booker, who was the mayor of Newark at the time, gratefully tweeted that there was zero looting and innumerable reports of acts of kindness in his city. Thousands of volunteers helped out in Baton Rouge in 2016, rescuing people from their homes after the floods. And that same spirit was found in the hundreds of spontaneous block parties that broke out in the 2013 floods here in Colorado. Without any refrigeration, everybody cooked their best shrimp and steak for their neighbors. Experience in a growing body of social science research demonstrates that neighbors help one another. Looting after disasters is so rare that most disaster sociologists consider it a myth. And things that are called looting are usually actually scavenging. Most people are generous and help one another. They don't panic and flee. They tend to stay with familiar people and places. New community bonds are formed after disruptions of all sizes and types in cities, suburbs, and rural communities. Humans do not lock themselves in bunkers and withhold provisions from others during times of crisis. Instead, they share with complete strangers. When floodwaters rise, people help their elderly, wheelchair-bound neighbors. Neighbors join other neighbors to search deep into the night to find a lost child. When a wildfire approaches, we gladly care for pets and livestock that belong to evacuated strangers. If a friend's child passes away, we spend weeks listening to him and comforting them. Your residents do not become zombies who pound on your door, desperate to eat your brains. They're most likely to become momentarily confused and momentarily lost, but they and you can recover. We are our brother's keepers. Despite more than 100 years of evidence, our laws and our response frameworks, like ICS, are infused with the presumption that if authorities are not in control, the situation is therefore out of control. Community engagement is treated like a threat rather than an asset, actively discouraged and to be controlled. I'll give you 3 brief examples out of hundreds that I personally experienced. I earlier mentioned that in 2016, the no-name storm that dumped 3 times the amount of rain as Katrina on Baton Rouge. In addition to having block parties, thousands of people mobilized to help rescue their neighbors stranded by floods. However, when they tried to put their boats in the water, many of my personal colleagues were threatened with arrest. Emergency management and law enforcement was more concerned about the threat of not being in control than allowing neighbors to save neighbors. My colleagues, threatened with arrest, wisely stroked the officer's ego, drove down the street out of sight, and put in the water there. The so-called Cajun Navy rescued more than 10,000 people, and that emergency management never could. The nearly identical story happened after Hurricane Harvey. Many were threatened with arrest for helping their neighbors, but in all, they rescued 30,000 people. If you think that any number of mutual aid agreements could have done that job, then I have a bridge in Brooklyn that I'd love to sell you. Despite the evidence, volunteers are regarded as a liability, someone extra you might have to rescue. And it's true, accidents do happen. After Hurricane Irma, a colleague of mine had a chainsaw accident that required him to be evacuated via helicopter. Although he made a quick and full recovery, emergency managers shared that story as a warning about letting volunteers help. But for the cost of one accident, his organization saved 5,000 households, roughly $13 million. Instead of doing a cost-benefit analysis about community engagement, ICS values command and control, even at the expense of our communities. Communities do work government cannot. Each group has its own responsibilities, resources, expertise, and authorities. We must recognize and respect our different stewardships. Government's stewardship often ends where private property begins. Emergency management's stewardship includes coordinating rescue, restoring public infrastructure, and applying for federal assistance, among many others. But the community does not wait patiently on the sidelines for someone to signal that the response phase is over and recovery has begun. Neighbors rescue neighbors. They evacuate friends, family, pets, and livestock. They engage in donations management. They provide emotional and spiritual care, even when refused entry into official resource centers. Some VOAD agencies have a humanitarian stewardship to provide mass care and immediate sheltering. Many faith communities have a stewardship to help the widow muck at her private property. Government doesn't have the capacity to know, much less control, the whole community response. Let communities lead themselves and focus your limited energies on the stars without a constellation. The typical emergency manager I encounter is experiencing his or her first, largest, and last disaster. Without much practical experience, they must rely on their training to know how to interact with others. We set up our emergency managers for failure in this respect because ICS infused with a command and control philosophy. It almost requires them to interact with others as though their ego is in charge. One thing they don't teach at the Emergency Management Institute, but really should, is how much energy community organizations and volunteers must spend stroking egos and flattering emergency managers' command and control worldview simply to ensure they don't stonewall or shut down humanitarian missions. Unity of command is not how communities work. It is the exception to the rule. Allow me to illustrate. Who is in charge? The HOA or the PTA or the retailer? Now that question is nonsensical. Okay, but surely government is in charge, right? Well, who's in charge of the bar mitzvah, the police or the rabbi? Okay, well then surely government has a hierarchy. Well, sometimes, but only in exceptional circumstances. So you tell me who's in charge, the Parks and Rec Department or the Water Department? Communities and governments are neither centralized nor decentralized. They have many centers. They are polycentric. Likewise, the responsibilities and authorities the concepts are almost useless. Legal authority is just one kind of authority. Legal authority does not run communities. Other authorities drive communities. Moral authority of relationships, purchasing authority, religious authority, constitutional guarantees conferred upon individuals, authorities to gather, help, raise money, and get donations. Instead of classifying communities by authority and the potential conflicts between authorities, it is much more useful to classify them by stewardships. Each part of the community has a stewardship over its own part. We currently train emergency managers that theirs is the only, or at least the most important, community stewardship. Instead, we must learn to recognize and honor the stewardship of other community actors. There is no single all-inclusive community constellation. Communities are not hierarchical. They are polycentric. There is no overarching authority. Instead, there are many stewardships. Polycentric stewardship is the way communities run. We must adapt our models like ICS to reflect the way communities really are. The path to adapting our models is to understand how communities actually work. There are 4 universal laws that govern communities. First, there is no pyramid, and you are not on top. This law is true for everyone during all phases of disaster relief, especially if you believe you are an exception. This subject came up at a state VOAD meeting where dozens of relief organizations and 4 emergency managers met together. One of them stood up and told the relief organizations, "You all need to get your act together and provide us a single point of contact." I shook my head and he asked why. I replied, "There are 4 counties represented in this room. In a disaster, which one of you is in charge?" Instinctively, 2 emergency managers blurted out, "Well, I am," while the other 2 gave me rather confused looks. I explained, "There are several reasons why my question does not make sense. So I'll make you a deal. The day you all can get your act together and provide a single point of contact to the VOAD, we will do the same. What you ask of us is impossible for the same reason it's impossible for you." There is no pyramid, and nobody is on top. But you might ask, what about emergency support functions? Everyone important has a place in the pyramid. Doesn't ICS already solve this problem? To that, I would reply, yes. Life would be much easier if everyone in the community just did it your way and followed orders. Or would it? Does your staff really have the capacity to give that many orders? Can you really control the tide? This brings me to the second universal law of communities. Volunteer means you're not the boss of me. Neither you nor anyone else may be as in charge as you were trained to believe. For example, the sheriff's department can order me out, but they can't order me in. The power company coordinates with, but does not report to the government. The American Red Cross doesn't tell the Salvation Army what to do. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does not tell the Southern Baptists what to do, as my Baptist colleagues are happy to remind me. But then again, most Baptists I know don't let other Baptists tell them what to do either. Even an emergency manager has no jurisdiction over how a Methodist minister performs a disaster relief ministry. Another reason why communities fall outside of any command structure is a competitor cannot tell another competitor what to do, which is the third universal law of communities. On the surface, this seems intuitive, but we attempt to violate this law all the time. In government, the command and control approach would seem to sidestep this problem by establishing unity of command. Now, perhaps in your jurisdiction, the guns and hoses always get along. Perhaps your elected officials really can do your job just as well as you or better. The city and the county never disagree, and the state is always there ready to support the local needs of counties. And thank goodness for the feds, bless their hearts. Now, in reality, each of our organizations has competing interests, even within the same commanding structure. Sometimes those interests align, like the stars. Other times they are separated as the North Star and the Southern Cross. To illustrate, I often have people raise their hands, and maybe you can do this virtually. Raise your hand if you have never experienced another government agency or community organization try to exert control over you by leveraging money, data, or the color of law. Any hands? Yeah, it's a pretty consistent response, but let me know if you did raise your hand. I want to work with you. If the third universal law of communities is a competitor cannot tell another competitor what to do, then the fourth law is we are all competitors. And it's time we acknowledge that fact. It is healthy to recognize competition in a polycentric world instead of glossing over this reality with euphemisms like partnership. We each have something that others want, and we all want something others have. Volunteers want access behind the perimeter. Emergency management wants control over community resources. Agencies want authority and funding from one another. Elected officials want credit. We compete for grants, mind space, brand, and volunteers. While there are a few winners in this perpetual power struggle, the primary losers are the survivors that we serve. This is what polycentric disaster relief looks like right now. This is a national map of community-led responses for Hurricane Ida and the North Carolina floods, the West Tennessee floods, Hurricane Nicholas, Boot Lake fire, and the Southeast Michigan floods. And that's just what's going on, right now. No government agency controls any of this. It falls completely outside of ICS. Nobody has the authority to tell anyone in the community what to do. Literally, nobody's in charge of this. And yet, in 9 years and 181 disasters, we've documented more than $1.2 billion of community service. Neighbors helping neighbors. In Hurricane Ida alone, more than 200 organizations have helped 10,000, 15,000 survivors. Volunteers for Florida, New Jersey, Idaho, and Texas answer calls from the bayous of Louisiana and Pennsylvania. This is crisis cleanup, and it's powered by the community. For those interested, I'd be happy to answer any more questions after this. In the VOID movement, we espouse 4 ideals called the 4 C's: cooperation, communication, coordination, and collaboration. I mentioned those earlier. It's not that we're any better at any of those things than anyone else. If the 4 C's came naturally, we would not need an organization devoted full time to their promotion. We just learned through very painful experience that we must work together, at least to some minimum degree, to accomplish our missions and overcome the 5th silent C that does come naturally: competition. While the 4 C's are foundational, they don't actually make disaster response happen. For that, you need the 4 R's of disaster relief. They are, in order of importance, relationships, resources, roles, and responsibilities. Implemented backwards, the 4 R's can have catastrophic effects. Responsibilities without roles yields confusion. Roles without resources leaves you with impotence, nothing gets done. And resources without relationships produces dysfunction, infighting, and backstabbing. Relationships drive communities. Our failure to train emergency management to develop and maintain community relationships sets them up for failure after disaster. Emergency managers who have been battle tested or live in very poor areas seem better equipped to foster relationships, often in spite of their training. They understand that partnership means a relationship between interdependent equals, whereas many others use the term euphemistically to mean a resource I can task. Relief organizations will truly be equal partners with government the day emergency management can call itself Voluntary Support Function 1 with a straight face. Partnership can feel like you're giving up control, but true partnership doesn't reduce your control because you didn't have it to begin with. Let the community lead. Communities and people heal faster when they help themselves and each other. Even during response, work yourself into the constellations that your communities have drawn before imposing your own. You will see those constellations easier when you understand the 4 universal laws of communities. There is no pyramid, and you are not on top. Volunteer means you're not the boss of me. A competitor cannot tell another competitor what to do, and we are all competitors. It's time to help emergency management and government officials interact with the whole community using the integrity of relationships rather than the personal ego encouraged by command and control systems. And if you believe that ICS describes the way the community actually runs, then you do not understand the essence of community. To that end, it is past time to develop an incident response framework that can allow communities to organize themselves while permitting ICS to function in the government sphere. This ICS 2.0, or the Incident Collaboration System, as I would call it, would adopt a polycentric stewardship model rather than a command and control and authority model. Please remember, communities already help themselves during all phases of disaster. Our frameworks just need to catch up to that reality. This new framework would consider the benefits of whole community engagement and acknowledge that all communities are polycentric collections of stewardships. Government is one of many centers. This whole community framework would permit whole coalitions of competitors to transparently work together around shared interests. It would also describe non-hierarchical interactions during the entire recovery cycle, rather than just the command and control relationships during the response phase. The word disaster originates from the Latin dis and astro, meaning a misfortune blamed upon a bad alignment of stars or planets. The literal translation of disaster is without a star, which seems poetically appropriate. When your community finds itself in a disaster and you feel as though the sky will fall, please remember, it's not your responsibility to hold up the heavens. Instead, if you will let them, the constellations of your community will orient you and give you direction and support. Let the community lead. Thanks.
Wow, thank you. So if anyone has any questions, you are welcome to unmute and ask your question directly. No, but it takes a few minutes. Again, you don't need to put it in
And
the
if I
chat.
didn't ruffle, I mean, if I didn't ruffle some feathers here, then you probably were asleep, but.
You know, while people are thinking of their questions, at our symposium, I believe it was in 2018, we had Matt Marchetti. I don't know.
Yeah, Matt Marchetti from Crowdsourced Rescue.
Yes, he did a presentation on how in the middle of Hurricane Harvey, they basically developed a computer program that connected people to volunteers to people who were in need. Specifically, like someone had a boat and 911 was so overwhelmed and the FEMA resources weren't there yet that they were able then to connect someone who had called 911 and said, hey, I'm on my roof, can you send some help, with someone who had a boat. And then those people were able to work together. And I believe there was a number of around 30,000 people that they were able to.
It was 30,000, yeah, after Harvey.
Yeah.
They repeated it after Irma, and they've been repeating it on smaller incidents ever since.
Yeah, pretty impressive. All right. Anyone have any questions? Either.
And you know what I would appreciate even more than questions is a little bit of pushback too, because that's where we can have, I think, some very constructive conversations. So I would love a little bit of pushback as well.
Anybody? Oh, don't be shy. All right, I'll get started with it then. I was a little, I don't want to use the term taken aback, but I questioned something you said when you were talking about, there is no such thing as looting. Because we've all seen during a disaster or a social emergency where people are walking into, Walmart or Best Buy and walking out with television sets. Well, I can appreciate, the mom going into the local 7-Eleven and getting milk or diapers, understand that's a necessity, but a big screen TV isn't a necessity, in my opinion.
Yes, yes. So this is one of those, so looting is a real thing in the same way that getting struck by lightning is a real thing. People die every year by getting struck by lightning. That is a fact. I don't live my life concerned about getting struck by lightning though. And it's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it is to say that it is so overblown, so completely overblown by media that it is considered a myth in that respect by disaster sociologists. If you want to talk about the most successful looters after a disaster, I mean, let's say right now the city of Louisville has locked down everything and, not letting anybody in without a pass. And that's because you have a police chief who loves his community. And, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's what he can do for his community. Okay, great. Worst case is what you go in and rummage through and grab some copper pipe. Okay, it's all going in the trash anyway. No, you shouldn't be doing it. But I'll tell you who the most successful looters are: contractors and insurance agents. Insurance companies are, sure, go steal some copper pipe or a big screen TV. The contractors are going to walk away with $10,000. And the insurance companies are going to walk away from, $50,000 that they should have paid with a $2,000 check. So, I think it's important for us to put it in perspective And especially as a part of that larger myth that creates the fear that drives so many of our policies that themselves are destructive for communities. I don't know if that's responsive.
Yes, definitely.
It's funny when I talk to emergency managers, and every single time, like that's almost always the first comment, like, no, looting's a real thing, you know.
It's a matter of perspective, for sure. All right. Simone was a very nice open eye view of how the power struggle affects badly the community.
And my goal is not to paint a doomsday picture of all of this, but I think that it's a healthy, it's healthy for us to talk about these things openly. That the competition is real, and the people who suffer the most are the survivors that we all serve.
Absolutely.
I would kind of say that it's not the emergency managers that are trying to be the controllers. It's the government over them.
Uh-huh.
I just, in working with many emergency managers, they really are trying to do what's best for the community, but most of the time it's their government constituents that are the controllers.
Uh-huh. So I Robin, thank you for bringing that up. Now you will notice that I kind of ribbed emergency managers here. Part of that was so that we could have a discussion. Now, I have so many wonderful emergency managers friends, and let's be honest, emergency management is a thankless job where 364 days out of the year, you're trying to explain to everybody why your position exists at all. And you're defending yourself against constant cuts. Oh, and by the way, you have to do 4 other jobs as well because we don't have funding for you. True. And it's on that one day of the year, when the bad thing happens, now finally you get to show your worth. And so I think, Robin, you make a fair point, right? That I'm ribbing emergency managers, unwarrantedly, and I am, and part of that's just kind of on purpose because I love you guys, and I want to have kind of a fun conversation. But I think bigger than that, there is, oh goodness, markets on markets, portrait interest, collaboration aperture. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, and this is a really, really messy diagram that is not finished, but this is for an academic article in a book that I'm writing about a related concept called unmarkets. But this is this diagram, this very messy, incomplete diagram, purports to show the strategy that will most likely get you what you want in any transaction. So imagine a transaction between 2 individuals, 2 organizations, you and me, doesn't really matter. And you have on the y-axis, you have a power dynamic. So maximum power versus minimum power. And over on the x-axis, you have a high chance of loss or a high chance of gain in any particular transaction. So what this is showing is that if we're in a transaction, let's say like this conversation, where neither of us has power over one another, and there's no particular chance of loss or gain, we're just having a conversation, that places us both the dots here within this center area, which I call the collaboration aperture. And what that means is that if we are both collaborative, we're more likely to get what we want. And indeed, this conversation is, a pretty darn collaborative, despite my, ribbings here and there. Now, what happens when things get thrown off a little bit? What happens when you have that same relationship? Let's say this orange, gap right here, which and we move this a little bit over to the right, and now there's a chance of gain. And now maybe that's a funder, and I'm somebody who wants the funding. Well, now we're over here and we get moved out of the collaboration aperture. And now our strategies to get what we want change a little bit. Down here, I'm more likely to engage in begging, political maneuvering, or lying and cheating and having a sense of entitlement. And that's going to put you off in similar ways. In the extreme quadrants here, you have bullying. So this is where you have maximum power and you have the highest chance for gain. Well, in disaster relief, like I'll work with these amazing, wonderful public servants who care deeply about their community and are totally underappreciated all the time. And during peacetime, there's no disaster. And we both exist in this collaboration aperture. We're all friends. Everything's great. The disaster happens, though, and it pushes us out of the collaboration aperture. And some people, we all know, and whether we're talking about emergency managers or elected officials or your boss, doesn't really matter. I'm not really picking on one particular job title. This is a human being thing. You cross this line, which I call the Jekyll-Hyde line. And it's where, Jekyll turns into Hyde. And now all of a sudden, this person with whom, you've got this good relationship is now acting like a bully. And often your best bet in, let's say, where there's a high chance of gain and you're dealing with a bully, your best bet to get what you want is actually passive aggression. And in the VOAD space, you got a lot of very passive aggressive people and we select for that. And the goal is to say, yes, sir, you're in charge, sir. How high do you want me to jump, sir? And then as soon as you stroke the ego, then you turn around and just do whatever you got to do. Now, over in the other quadrant, you have acquiescence. So if you have a minimum power and a high chance of loss, your best bet is acquiescence. So this blue line, for example, might be the relationship between a prisoner and a warden. Up here in the top left, it's creating chaos. So this up here in the top right and the top left is where tyrants typically hang out. So you might have a tyrant who's in charge and acts like a bully most of the time, but now the coup's on its way. You still have a lot of power, but now you have a high chance of loss. What's your best bet? Create chaos and create a lot of it. I think we've seen echoes of that even within our own local and national politics. Now, one of the questions that naturally comes to my mind is there a way to increase the size of the collaboration aperture, or is it fixed? I believe there is, and that is through the power of relationships. To the extent that you have a stronger relationship with someone, this aperture opens up and the space for collaboration increases accordingly. And the likelihood or the incentive to bully or be passive aggressive or acquiesce or create chaos decreases. So Robin, thanks for calling me out on that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I agree. The problem is the best way to increase that collaboration aperture is to play together. But there's no time, no money, no opportunity, until a disaster. And so I agree that your collaboration aperture can totally widen if you have the opportunity beforehand.
Yes.
But not always does it do that. And there's got to be some simple way to bring relationships together. It just doesn't always happen.
I wish that there was a simple way to bring people together and make relationships. When you figure it out, let me know, please. I'm searching.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out too. But I totally see what you're saying. But it just, money and time is always in the way.
Yep.
One of the benefits, if I could call it a benefit, of this pandemic is that the leadership that controls the purse strings, a lot of them are recognizing that they need to put some money into our ability to collaborate and do exercises together, do trainings together. I think a lot of folks have recognized how important that is with what they're seeing over the past year and a half. So I'm going to jump in here. We are right at the time. If people have more questions for Aaron, can we share your contact info, Aaron?
Yes, in fact, I put my name, phone number, and email address. I would love if you were a little bit too shy to push back. Please give me a call. I would love to have a conversation. Thank you, Robin, and thank you everybody else for pushing back and for asking questions. I really appreciate the engagement, and thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron. It was wonderful to hear your perspective and hear everybody else's comments and your responses. So folks, please make sure that you complete that evaluation. That just really helps us in developing our programs and giving you all what you're looking for. If you need a certificate of completion, please make sure that you send me an email at barb.clark@imail.org. You've all gotten emails from me, so you should have it. And then some of you got in late, and I don't know if that was a time, geographical time difference there. I apologize if we didn't make it clear that it was Mountain Time. If you want to watch the whole presentation, I will be posting it on our YouTube channel. So just go to Intermountain Center for Disaster Preparedness on your YouTube, and you'll find us. It takes usually about an hour or so for me to be able to get that on there, so it won't be available right away. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you all on March 23rd for our next Lunch and Learn. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Aaron. And everybody stay safe, stay healthy if you can. And we'll see you the next time. Take care all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.